I am very pleased to welcome all of you, but especially our first presenters, John Richardson, church planter at the Prodigal Church in Fresno. John is a what year graduate of Fresno Biblical Seminary? You're on mute now, John, in obedience to me.
Seminary 2007.
2007, and you went to Fresno Pacific before that.
That's right, class of 03.
Okay, and Forrest Jenin is the pastor of Neighborhood Church in Visalia. And Forrest, have you been there 12 years?
Just a bit over, yeah. So.
Okay, and he is currently enrolled in the online program at the seminary. Just a short plug, we've got 11 new students this fall, most of whom are Mennonite brethren. And so we're very pleased about that. Well, welcome to all of you. It's great to see so many friends. I won't go all the way down the line with all of the people that are smiling, but thank you for joining us today. Would you bow with me for prayer as we begin? Lord of life, Lord of the world and Lord of the church, your passion and your compassion move us. And we ask to learn better how we can follow both today as we spend time in conversation. Please guide Forrest and John as they prompt us and the rest of us as we both listen and engage. Thank you. Forrest has agreed to lead off. He's going to talk for several minutes, both about some principles that he's learned, but also some stories about how it's working out for the church at Neighborhood. Go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may find yourself. Excited to be able to just chat about, what was the title of this, Lynn? What do we? You're on mute, buddy.
That's because I don't have anything to say.
Yeah.
We all looked at whatever our invitation said this morning as we clicked in. So it's something like John's article,
Sure.
Learning from the spiritually
Nuns and Duns.
Right.
Millennials, Generation Z, all of that fun stuff. Yeah, and I would definitely include Generation Z in this conversation only because they're now becoming adults, they're entering the workforce, they're graduating college, some of the older Gen Zs. And so I think what's going on with them is significantly different than what's even happening with millennials, especially older millennials in their mid-30s, mid to late 30s. And so so I think we're struck by a couple of things. If you include Gen Z and millennials, it's more than 50% of the US population. So that's really, really significant. I think millennials are somewhere in the 20 to 25% of our US population, which is a big deal. But only about 10% of churches in America have 20 to 25% of millennials attending. And there are some churches, about 20% of churches in America have 0 millennials attending. I mean, so this is a real problem. You might even start using dramatic words like crisis. So because if we're not reaching, if we're missing an entire generation, it's really significant, and it's a really, really big problem. And so I think churches need to figure out how to connect with and reach millennials and the generation following them, the Gen Zs. And so I think we at Neighborhood, we think about that all the time. And we're always trying to figure out how to close the gap. I think in terms of spiritual nuns, right? There's all those statistics running around out there that's the fastest growing religious sort of demographic in America. are the nuns, those kind of checking the box, no religious affiliation. Many of those, not atheists, perhaps agnostics, but many are kind of used to be Christian or used to identify with some Christian tradition. So that's significant. Christians are fleeing. Dave Kinnaman and Barna in their latest Faith of the Exiles, their latest numbers are about 64% of young adults are fleeing the local church and sort of joining that nun category. So that's still significant. I remember when I was a youth pastor, just transitioning out of youth ministry, you know, they were throwing around 75% and, you know, all of that. I tend to trust Dave Kinnaman and Barna and their work. And if you haven't picked up Faith of the Exiles, you absolutely should make that standard reading, probably for your entire staff. I think it's maybe been out 2 or 3 weeks at this point. So yeah, so anyway, with all of that in mind, we try to approach with a couple of I guess kind of general things in mind. The first is if there's a scale of 1 to 10 on kind of knowing the story of Jesus, we just assume people are at a 1 or a 2. I think churches, for the most part, assume people are at an 8 or a 9. And so they leverage the Sunday morning experience to try to get people to make some decision for Jesus. I would say that's a mistake, only because people don't know the story. In fact, my experience is even Christians don't know the story. And so we assume people don't know the story. And so that shapes a lot of what we do, especially for some entry points like Sunday morning environment. We're also always trying to ask the question, how do we shrink the gap for the person for the millennial dude that is college educated, wealthy, and by wealthy, I just mean has some excess income, not necessarily super wealthy, and doesn't really need God or want God or think the church is relevant, or, you know, grandma made them to go to church, but as soon as grandma stopped making them, they never looked back. How do we close that gap? Like, from the person watching the NFL on a Sunday morning, the 35-year-old millennial whose life is working for him generally, or at least he would argue life is working for him. How do we sort of close that gap, and again, remind people that Jesus and the local church is a relevant community. I think for us at Neighborhood, we've had some success at doing that. Neighborhood is primarily a church of millennials, primarily a church of millennials that would be kind of de-churched, I would think. Central California, where we're located, is if California had a Bible Belt, we'd probably be it. Many were forced to go to a really bad church as kids, and they hated it or got hurt by it. A lot of people coming out of Catholicism, different things like that. And so our primary demographic is millennials and Generation Z. We don't have a ton of Gen Xers, or and then even less boomers. About 85% of Neighborhood is under the age of 45. 40% of our church would identify as either unchurched or de-churched. And so for us, creating safe spaces for people to ask faith questions, things like that, really, really important. One of the most exciting environments we have, we just call it Men's Happy Hour. And so it starts at 5, goes to about 6:30 a couple times a month. And it's literally just a happy hour where people can just have safe conversation and share. We do another thing called Theology on Tap, which meets at a local tap room, and we just discuss just things of faith, questions of faith, things like that. And so I think being intentional about our environments is really, really important. So, I mean, I don't know, those are just some kind of random kind of stream of consciousness thoughts in terms of how we do that. In terms of, like, you know, I know always the question is, well, you know, what about, you know, are they becoming Christian, or how are you discipling them? We've got over 70 baptisms thus far in 2019. And so people are coming to faith, people are coming back to faith. And it's, yeah. So anyway, I think it's really a fun ride. So,
let me interrupt just
yeah.
a moment as you pass the baton to John, but you use words like trying to shrink the gap between
Sure.
their life is good and their need for Jesus. You talked about creating safe space and Theology on Tap. Can you just say a little bit more about how do you make the space safe? What is it safe from? What is it safe for? What do you mean by that? How do you actually do it?
Yeah, I think especially for people that have been hurt by church, or found the church irrelevant, or found the church to be an unsafe space to question faith. When I say safe, I mean creating a space where no question is off limits, no story is going to be judged. Whatever baggage you're walking in here with is fine baggage to have, and we're not in a hurry. You know, I think so often we want to press the issue, and you know, it's a long game. It's not something that's people's faith journeys are not this very quick overnight thing. I think there's a lot of unlearning that has to do, especially for people who maybe went to church as kids but left it. And so just creating different spaces where that can happen, including Sunday mornings, even our preaching. We intentionally use language to give lots of space for people to sort of get settled in their own heart on things. We don't try to kind of force things. I mean, outside of sort of the three, Palmer Becker's sort of three summaries of Anabaptism, we really don't press a lot of issues, especially where there's lots of debate anyway in the church. We just say there's a lot of debate in the church and you don't have to agree with me. Here's kind of where I'm at, and here's some other things to think about. And so, yeah, that's what I mean by creating safe space. You have to communicate. This is a safe space. You can say whatever you want, and we're just going to have an honest conversation. To be authentic is huge. So, anyway.
Well, I'm not trying to press you out of safe space, but can you think of an example or two, either of the kind of baggage that people have brought from other churches, or the kind of question that they were surprised that you were willing to broach?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, some examples, like not long ago, this blew my mind. I mean, I don't really get shocked anymore. But there's people of different faith traditions at Neighborhood. Obviously different Protestant and Catholic faith traditions, but then also we have people from Islam. I had someone the other day come up and identify themselves as a Zoroastrian from Syria. And I'm like, is that even a thing anymore? I thought that was this ancient Persian like faith tradition. And I was like, what? She's like, well, we're immigrants or whatever. I think the hot button issues, right? Of course, issues of sexuality are of course a big issue. And people, especially Gen Z, want to know where we land on some of those issues.
Okay.
So I mean, anyway, anything and everything, but just creating a space where you can belong before you believe, absolutely. Okay. Foundational. If you don't, you'll never reach millennials or Gen Z. So
right. One of the ways we've talked about it is belonging, believing, behaving. Is there an order that you have to follow there?
Belong. You can serve. We have lots of people serving in our church that are not Christian. Lots
the
of
guy that I heard preach, I think me. The guy I heard preach.
Me, yeah. Yeah, I know.
That's supposed to be a joke, but nobody.
No, but really, we just try to be like, hey, you can belong, you can be a part of our family, and just not yet be there. And again, and we assume they're not there. And so again, when we take an annual survey and we just ask, hey, where would you put yourself? And the way we kind of identify it is, hey, have you been to any church at all, even one time in the last 5 years? And then how would you sort of identify yourself? Would you say you grew up in church or just no church experience at all? And so again, about 40%, it's been pretty consistent the last 3-4 years, right around that would sort of identify that way.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to press you so hard there, but
it's totally fine.
John, I'm afraid I'm taking your time and maybe everybody else's. So John, you're up. Same kind of question.
Sure. So appreciate that a ton. Also, the belong before you believe stuff you guys stole. So I'm gonna have to change my notes there, planning on talking about that. But I think it's such a core value that instead of, you gotta believe like us, behave like us, then you can belong to us. I think we need to flip that, and they belong. And then that may actually help them be able to believe and then to behave in a way that honors Christ. And so I think that radical acceptance can bring transformation. And I think that's what we also see in the life of Christ. More on that later. There are three qualities that I really feel resonate with the millennial and Gen Z and spiritual but not religious kind of people. Number one, and I think this is something not very new but very old, story. Stories are inspiring. People love stories. This generation loves stories. The ancient Hebrew culture loves stories. That's why we still have all these stories. They were first passed down orally before they were ever written down. And stories are inspiring. You know what's not inspiring? Equations. Equations don't inspire anybody. The Bible is a narrative. It's not theological equations. And so sharing and showing how we are the continuation of God's redemptive work in the world, I think is extremely key. When we look at the Bible, we know that it's not a list of things that you can't do and things you can do. It would be more simple if that's what it was. Unfortunately, that's not what it is. Why? Well, I think lots of reasons. I think one, that rules of what to do and what not to do don't inspire people. They don't transform people. They might keep them in line, but they're not transformative, and they're not filled with love. Stories inspire. Stories change us. And so, kind of with each thing that I want to share about this generation, this demographic of people, I want to share kind of a practical thing that we've done or tried at Prodigal. We're just an experiment. We're 2 years into this. We certainly don't have all the answers, but because we're new, we can kind of try and get away with attempts that maybe other churches can't. Some are big risks, some aren't so risky, but with this whole concept of narrative and story, we did a series called Fierce, and it was looking at women of courage and bravery in the scriptures. And with each story of what we did, Deborah, and we did Esther, and we did the woman who anointed Jesus and then wiped her tears with her hair, and a couple others. It was a couple years ago. But we creatively told the story. Like for the book of Esther, we researched what the Jewish people do at Purim when they retell the story. And they get, whenever they say the name Mordecai, everybody goes crazy in the Jewish congregation. And then whenever they say the name Haman, they boo. And it's kind of a fun way that all the families in a Jewish synagogue will participate in the story. And so when we told the story of Esther, we handed out party horns and noisemakers, so that whenever I said the word Mordecai, everyone would go crazy. And whenever I said Haman, everybody kind of booed. And it was it was just so great. We didn't have any scriptures on the screens. People didn't have their Bibles open, but we creatively told the story. We didn't quote the Bible, but we told the story. And the feedback we received from that has been so positive. People will say that was the favorite series that we've done in our 2+ years of being a church because of the narrative. Secondly, authenticity. I think that the generation younger than me, I'm near the younger end of Gen X. I'll be 39 here in November, but I think this next generation, they have a BS meter. They have an innate sense of whether the person speaking really believes what he or she is saying. And I've just found this to be true. I was a youth pastor for 11 years, and people know if we're buying what we're selling. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can say to a millennial is, I don't know. sometimes acknowledging that their questions are better than our answers is really, really powerful. And one of the ways that we've kind of practically implemented this is a sermon series that we did called Confessions of a Church Pastor. This series we did at the beginning of last year, 2019, in January of this year. And we just, the heart was to kind of get rid of the myth of the mystical pastor, that we have it all together and that we're different and more super spiritual than everybody else. And kind of the base verse was from 2 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about Moses in the veil, and Moses used to put a veil over his face so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of the glory that was fading away. Moses didn't want people to know that when the glory left, so he left the veil on all the time. Paul kind of is throwing Moses under the bus here. And he's saying Moses was being disingenuous by keeping the veil on all the time. And a pastor friend of mine told me about a church growth conference that he had with his denomination. And the premise of the conference was, we'll teach you how to double your church size in 24 months. Here, just follow these principles. And here's one of the things that the company told these churches. They said, no matter how big or small your church is, you need to have a camera camera angle on the pastor, and then put them on a big screen, because people want their pastors to be larger than life. And that's probably true. People may want that. The trouble is, none of us are larger than life. No matter how big we build our Emerald City Church, when you get behind the curtain, it's always just going to be like a person. It's always going to be a small person. So as the pastor prodigal, I keep the veil on, and the church will live under the assumption that I always operate in the anointing of the glory of the Lord. Everybody wins. The people get a pastor that's larger than life, and I get to walk around on spiritual clouds. The people, it's ooh and ah at how spiritual I am. But it's a dangerous thing, and it turns people away from Jesus, because inevitably people will see that there's no such thing as wizards. That it's just some person behind the curtain. And so that honesty and transparency, not only from the pulpit, but also the worship ministry, and also in our kids ministry, and also what we post on social media. There should be an honesty, being real, and vulnerability, whatever you want to call it. I just think it's so essential to our spiritual lives. And I think it resonates with the upcoming generations. And then lastly, this is a big one. The judgmentalism of offense. To be aptly aware of this when it comes to Gen X, Gen Z, spiritual but not religious people. And for many of us, we're going, oh yeah, totally. Those Pharisaical Christians, they're the problems. They're judgmental. But that's the problem in and of itself. The problem isn't they're judgmental. The problem is I'm judgmental and you're judgmental. We have convinced ourselves in the church that we're not the ones that are judgmental, that it's other churches, that it's other people. And I don't know one judgmental person that admits that it's a struggle for them, myself included. And so working, you know what helps us relate to people and become less judgmental? And this I think is one of the more transformational spiritual practices I've ever done. Working outside of the church. You're rubbing elbows with real people in real life without the walls and expectations of the church. They don't even know you're a pastor. My good friend oversees a line of fragrances, men's and women fragrances, from here to San Francisco. And so for years, every holiday season, I would go in and sell fragrances at Macy's. And it was one of the most life-giving spiritual things I've ever done. I left the church walls and rubbed elbows with people who had no idea I was a pastor. It was so amazing. So many times while working in the church, we begin to think that church life is real life, or that my church world is the real world. It is not. The church world is not the real world. And we become unrelatable to most people. We're great at relating to Christians, but people that are outside our church bubble, we become increasingly distant from them. Or worse yet, we become increasingly isolated from them. And I don't think this is the call for us as followers of Jesus. So what do we do to kind of combat this judgmentalism that's inside of me, that's inside of our church? You belong before you believe, to steal what Lynn and Forrest said earlier. This is a core value. It's not believe the right things, behave the right way, then you belong. No, if you flip it, I think it bears more fruit. In my experience, it bears more fruit. You belong before you believe. As is, we love you, you're accepted. And when what happens is acceptance brings transformation. They begin to believe in the risen Christ and behave in ways that honor him. And this goes back to what I said earlier, we're intentionally surrounding ourselves with people who are not Christians. That actually makes us less judgmental. When I spend time with people who are not Christians, it makes me less judgmental. It makes me less, I have the answers that will fix you. And it becomes more about this journey of pursuing Jesus together. And that posture, I believe, is more transforming. And I've seen bear more fruit in the lives of nuns and duns, in the lives of Gen Z, in the lives of Gen X. I think you're on mute, Lynn. I'm not sure. Lynn, we can't hear you, big guy.
Okay, I heard you say creativity, authenticity, and judgmentalism awareness, which can be overcome by spending time with real people.
Yeah.
And you gave us very nice examples of each. We're going to take a little time now for others of you to engage. You may have your own stories to tell. You may want to challenge something. You may want more information. But the idea of having this technology here is to give you a chance to get involved. So flip your unmute off and start talking to us.
I guess I'll start since no one's rushing to jump in. Thanks, Forrest. And John, appreciate that a lot. Can you hear me? Am I on mute?
You're good.
Good. All right. It is interesting. I mean, I've pastored Dinuba Mennonite Brethren Church. It has a new name. As of Sunday, we're now New Life Community. So we haven't rolled that out, officially in our church we have, but I thought it was interesting in selecting a new name that because we're largely a boomer and builder church, that was a pretty radical name choice. But our Gen Z and our millennials were a little disappointed that we just weren't radical enough. So it just makes me laugh. I mean, the reality is that 96% of our budget comes from people 50 years of age and older. So we are, an established church in many ways, but we have to make this transition. The truth is, this is my life. Forrest, you know my son really, really well because you were his youth pastor a long time ago and stuff. So, my son was an atheist. Today, I wouldn't call him done with religion or have none, but, he's a spiritual kind of person. But I have to learn how to talk to my son as well as my, my three daughters. And the questions they have are not questions that people in church would be comfortable with. And they're not questions that I really handled well as a pastor when they were young growing up. So I have to see myself, John, when you said that you got to own the judgmentalism. I mean, I have to see that myself in so many different ways. And I find myself now 12 years later coming back to be a pastor of a church. And people ask me, how do you enjoy it? And I think, man, the whole world has changed. It's changed 2 or 3 times already since I was last a pastor. But we're just less able to move forward. By the way, thank you so much for naming Palmer Becker. That gives me some hope, even though I'm not his age. I think he's passed, hasn't he? Yeah, I knew him when I was in Kansas a long time ago.
I think he's still alive, but I don't know for sure.
Is he? Yeah. Well, that gives me some hope that that maybe a guy like me might even be able to be fresh in some way. So.
We love his work. I mean, those 3 statements that he boiled Anabaptism down are so helpful in communicating. And what I have found is Anabaptism is really attractive to nuns and duns, and millennials and Gen Z, or however you want to categorize all this. You know, they like that Jesus is the center of the faith. They love that community is the center of our life, and they love that reconciliation is the center of our work. I mean, that is like, you are straight speaking their language. And to me, we are perfectly positioned as Anabaptists to reach the nuns and duns and these younger generations, because Anabaptism, I think to waste our tradition right now in the cultural moment we find ourselves in is just a grievous error. We should be leaning into our roots because it has a lot to offer this moment.
I would second that for sure. That Anabaptism offers a third way, which is the way of Jesus, to the different extremes, the right or to the left, whether that's in politics or whether that's in theological studies. Our focus is Jesus, and that third way absolutely resonates because a lot of these nuns and duns are, well, the worldview I was presented with in the church growing up doesn't seem to fit my reality, and so they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And don't throw, the baby is Jesus. Don't throw Jesus out with the Christian bathwater. And so I certainly, even in my own experience, you know, I was swimming in a sea of deconstructionism, and Anabaptism was a life raft that I held on to that not just allowed me to kind of finish some deconstruction, but began to reconstruct my faith. Often millennials will throw in the towel after deconstruction because they think, well, it doesn't make any sense. What I was told doesn't fit anymore. But they're missing the reconstruction, the rebuilding it back up again. What do I believe? What is the center of my faith? And Jesus brings us hope in that.
Okay, now I'm going to interrupt, remind you that in the chat, I've given you access to Palmer Becker's little 24-page pamphlet. You can download it yourself if you'd like. Also, I want to note that we've got a chat question here. Jamie, you turned off your mic. I hope that means you've got a question, or did you just did I misread it? But
you did not.
Dan Strutz is asking, and you can see it in the chat for us, Don. If we're to believe that the church is a believer's church, I assume for that it is a believer who belongs. So when we say belonging, what do we mean by that? What are we belonging to? Is there a line before belonging? Is it welcoming? To belonging, that is becoming a member of the body. Either of you want to respond to that? Thank you, Dan, for that question. Appreciate it. And please feel free to follow up if we don't address it the way you'd like.
Are you asking if John or, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name from Neighborhood Church.
Forrest,
sorry. I'm Jamie from
Jamie.
Church, worship pastor there, as well as help with some discipleship stuff. Were we waiting for either of you to respond, or I would love to respond to that question?
Go for it. I bet Forrest
Jamie.
won't mind a bit.
Okay.
He was hoping for somebody smarter than him, and he found it.
Oh my word. No, just to speak to that belonging question, met with a young adult who just this week, very deconstructing in her faith, is on the worship team and actually asked me, what is your stance on me leading from the front if I'm in the midst of deconstructing my faith? Can I do that? And my response to her was, absolutely yes. Absolutely. You are using your gifts for the glory of God and the edification of the church. And just because you currently have doubts we are so thankful that you're doing it here, that you're doing it with us, that you're walking with us, and that you're being authentic in your faith, saying, I want to know Jesus. I want to know God. I don't know that I have it all figured out, but that is her perception, is that she has to have it all figured out before she can serve or before she can belong. So when I think of belonging, I think more of not necessarily in a membership capacity, but the fact that we are holding space for that generation, that we are recognizing them for the God-given gifts that they have inside of them, and we're pulling them out and we're saying, God gave this to you. He created you. I want to see more of this. God wants to use this in his body. And you do not have to have it all figured out. You do not have to be perfect. None of us are, in order to be in this space. So to jump over, was that a sufficient answer? Does somebody else want to?
Amen.
Yeah, beautiful, Jamie. That's
Same.
yeah, I mean, that's phenomenal example. I think, yeah, I don't know. I don't understand believers church. Maybe, I think the church is a community. It's a family, and we still have a formal membership. We don't call it membership. We actually call it ownership. And we talk about engagement more. And, yes, if you want to be an owner, we say, we baptize you if you're not already baptized. But for us, it's actually a secondary conversation. Anyone can engage at neighborhood. Anyone can give. Anyone can serve. Anyone can be in community. Anybody can invite people to neighborhood, right? Like anybody can do that. They don't need to be anything, and they can fully engage and be a part of our family. And so, and we use that language. We use family language, like, yeah, this is your extended spiritual family. So. But yeah, Jamie, that was just so amazing. Yeah, where are you, Jamie? What church are you at?
I'm at North Fresno Church.
Awesome.
So
Hey, you're just down the road.
we are.
Yeah.
So
Nobody else
those
wanted
are-
to respond to that question. I had just a quick, as I was listening to John say story, for you youth pastors or children's pastors out there, a resource for you specifically about creative ways to tell stories. Michael Novelli, this book, as well as Shared, Shaped by the Story, some very creative ways to, I've used these with some young adults. Even you can kind of tailor them, but the same way, it's creative ways to tell not just creation story, redemption story, but also invitations to telling our story. And I think that was very powerful, John, the way that you said, it just engages people in a completely different way than sitting in the pews and just listening to someone speak. The fact that they get to engage in what's going on. Another thing that I was thinking of last Easter, we had a young woman, and this can be challenging for lead pastors to give up some of their space for someone in the congregation to speak. But hearing this woman share just a testimony of God's faithfulness, and like you said, showing that she is a continuation of God's redemptive work in the world. She was able to share a bit of her story and her current wrestlings, which I think is so important. She shared some of the ways that she's still wrestling with God. And she's a mid-30s gal, and it was very nerve-wracking for her to share. She needed a lot of pastoral mentoring to get up to that point. I had to sit next to her on stage while she gave her testimony, but it was totally worth it. I mean, some people would say that was the most powerful portion of the sermon. No, I mean, music was great. I was not offended by nobody saying the music wasn't the best part. The sermon was great, but her sharing her story and saying, this is where God has brought me to understand how he's redeeming my life and my role in being a part of God's family to redeem others and bring others to the body of faith, was life-changing for people in our congregation, and specifically to that demographic, specifically to the 20s and 30s. We heard a lot back from them about that. So
thank you for those really practical ideas, Jamie, especially. And please, Jamie, if you don't mind, go to the chat and enter the bibliographic information on that book. Thank you.
I will.
Thanks. I'm less practical, maybe more theological, but I'm thinking about the Jesus is the center of our life business, of our faith, in terms of the question about belonging. And I'm reminded that when Palmer Becker says Jesus is the center of our faith, he doesn't mean we're not Trinitarian. He doesn't mean that believing doesn't matter. What he's doing is he's picking up on something that the Anabaptist Vision by Harold Bender says, and that is that for us, the important thing is following Jesus. Not saying certain facts about Jesus are true. That's not what believing is for us. Believing means to walk in the way. And the way is always on the move. I think the way is one of the most common, both Old and New Testament, I guess it's a metaphor, word pictures for what it means to be a Jesus person. God told David, don't build me a temple, I'm on the way. And so I think one of the things that I'm forever trying to unlearn is that church is a place where I go instead of a way on which I walk. Okay, great old man's theory, right, Mark? But let's hear more about the practice. And please, if Dan, if we didn't answer your question very well, please come back and ask us more about it. Kyle, you were asking about the 2 books. Were you asking Mark or?
He was asking Jamie to put the books in the chat.
Okay, got it. Fantastic, thank you. Dan is saying I can't talk to clarify further, but I appreciate the thoughts. Amy, to see if there are any boundaries for those who've not yet believed, which kind of takes us back to a comment that Chris Bennett chatted. I don't know if Chris wants to jump in here too.
No, I'm not really able to take some time to actually talk.
Okay.
So.
All right. So Mark Baker is a person who's passed on the idea. It was actually a missionary to India from the Mennonite Brethren Church, whose name I'm just completely blanking on at the moment. Somebody help me here. Who wrote the paper first that talked about how having a centered set means that we're going in the direction of Jesus. Bounded sets means that we live with fences, which is the better way to identify. And I'm looking at the man's face now in my memory, but I'm still not drawing up the name. So somebody help me with that. But okay, let's go back to John and Forrest. I said that you'd have another chance to step in. Do you have another thought that you want to share with us?
So yeah, like this core value, you belong before you believe. If we really believe that, if we live that out, then we can't have a special membership for like the real members. And so we don't have membership. We might eventually have something more along the lines of what Neighborhood has said as well. I don't think membership is a bad thing. But for us, just in the early onset of our church, to say, hey, you belong as is, but you don't really belong unless you're giving 10%, inviting people to church, serving in some capacity, that doesn't really resonate. And so, yes, there are boundaries of what, I'm not giving the pulpit to a non-Christian. So I think teaching is a big deal. So I don't think that a non-believer should be sharing the Word of God on a Sunday and leading in that way. Certainly there are countless other avenues that they can serve and be a part of it. But, it's not like I'm excluding just non-believers from the pulpit. There's plenty of believers that I don't really want to touch the microphone either at our church. So, but I we have non-Christians serving in our kids ministry. And I have 2 young children. I have a 2-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy. And nothing brings me greater joy than when I, in between services, go and see my son hanging out with this non-Christian who just shared a Bible story with him. I just think it's so wonderful. I think it's so wonderful to help my son grow up with not a judgmental bone in his body. And I think it's also so wonderful that these non-Christians now are rubbing elbows with Christians all the time, helping set up, helping tear down, meeting parents, being encouraged, learning a Bible story. It's so amazing. And I just think Lynn's concept of the way makes a ton of sense. When I was a teenager, it was like, I came to Jesus because I was scared of hell. And so then I got heaven. And it wasn't until like 10 years later where I go, oh, wow, Jesus can change my life now. Like, he can make a difference and I can live for him here. And actually forgiveness is better than seeking revenge. Love is better than hate. Peace is better than violence. All these things that are actually real practical life experience is an attractive way to live. Following Jesus is an attractive way to live. And I think in this, I think God's doing something new to where now it's like people are beginning to follow Jesus because it's an attractive way to live. Giving is better than taking and acquiring for ourselves. Selflessness is better than selfishness. And they begin to follow Jesus. And then maybe 10 years later, they go, oh, I get heaven too? This is amazing. It gets even better. And so I'm really seeing that happen a lot. And it's because it's about this way. And so for us to have non-Christians serve at our church, of course, they get an up-close encounter with people who are on this way, on this journey of following Jesus, and acceptance brings transformation.
Yeah, I think our strategy is sort of, if you hang out with Christians long enough, like healthy Christians, you can't help but become one. So we just, yeah, I mean, we mix, I mean, we never, ever, almost in any environment, can assume that everybody in the room is a Christian. And that's like a really good thing, I think.
Let me ask you, Forrest, about another thing that I'm aware of. You've got this thing on your cars that says FOR. Are you all foreigners, or is there a country I haven't heard of, or what is that FOR stuff?
Yeah, so.
Tell me also about, I see your kids pastor sitting right there.
Yep.
Good to see you again. But tell me about your party. Well, the kids have a party every week, I know that, but tell us about your party animal who's a member of your staff too.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I mean, part of reconciliation being the center of our work is partnership in our community, caring about our community. In fact, this last Sunday I actually did the sermon was essentially a theology of place, that where you are matters, like your spot on the map matters, and we're to build deep roots and lean in and invest in our city and love our city and to be for our city and the people in it. And so that shapes.
That's what the FOR is.
Yeah.
FOR Visalia.
And so that's just how we talk about reconciliation being the center of our work. I mean, certainly reconciliation covers all sorts of things, relationships, and but really as a church, we want to corporately respond the way that we should all be behaving individually, in terms of saying, we don't want to whine about problems or talk problems to death. We just simply we have the opportunity to be the solution to problems. And so, yeah, so we spend a great deal of time and energy investing in our city. We just started a 3-week campaign this last Sunday, where we're encouraging people to just give, and all the money they're going to give over the next 3 weeks goes to our 7 what we call community partners that we've vetted and believe in their mission. They're going to serve next week. This Sunday's Serve Week, and so then we have 19 or 20 different projects that those 7 community partners have created, challenging everybody to give at least 1 hour, right? And then the last week is just kind of, and don't forget about literally the people that live on your block. So we're just, and then in the spring, we do just a 1 Sunday, we cancel church and go serve our city. I mean, so these are just ways that we kind of say, here's how we're for Visalia, how we're for our city, how reconciliation has become a part of our work. And one of the ways you mentioned the parties, Lynn, one of the ways that we close the gap, right, between nuns and duns and the church is, well, we just try to make it really easy for the people who attend neighborhood to invite their friends to church. So we have a full-time staff member. She's, her title is the chief party planner or chief party thrower. And at least once a month on a Sunday in between our services, we're throwing some kind of party with food trucks and a variety of other kind of things. Some months it's every week, like December, we just, everybody celebrates baby Jesus. And so we lean into that opportunity that we have as a culture. And so every Sunday morning, most Sunday nights, there's something going on. We're throwing parties, we're eating together. We take advantage of the weather of California, and so we have a lot of space outside, and so we throw parties. And literally just the other day, I mean, we just threw on kind of the harvest thing. And what did we do? We you know, kids were painting pumpkins, and we had the roasted corn food people here, and it was just kind of a fun thing. And I saw someone, and I said, oh, I just started talking, and they were out playing cornhole or something out on one of the little lawn pieces we have, and somehow it came out. I said, oh no, we didn't go to church today. We just came for this. We just came for the party, which is totally fine. I mean, it's all good. And the other thing I'd say, in terms of the nuns and duns and millennials and Gen Zs, to assume to not leverage their onlineness is just a massive error. We live stream all 3 of our services, as well as, you know, podcasts, and, you know, watch it later online or whatever. I would say this is what we hear most of the time. I've been watching for several months, but today's my first time. That's pretty standard story at Neighborhood Church. Gen Z especially, millennial as well, but not quite as much as Gen Z. They are online, period. And so to not be online is just a massive mistake, because that's where they are. And so many people will sort of just get a feel for us, or they'll binge watch. They'll use us like Netflix. I ran into one person who doesn't really do church, but they watched like 8 different teaching series we did before ever setting foot on our campus. And so it's a front door. It's not a back door. Don't ever think like, you know, hey, we're going to keep people if they, it's a front door and it's a side door. The people who go here when they're on vacation or sick, they'll watch us online, but mostly it's a front door. People, they come experience us virtually before they ever come experience us in real life. And so
totally agree. Let me just piggyback on that real quick. And so I know our social media, our website people follow churches that do that really, really well, because that's where people are. Millions and millions of people are there. And this was really hit home in a practical way for me just this week. On Friday, I'm going to be doing a funeral for someone I went to high school with. And in between our services, I'll go into like a little back room, and I'll see where our worship guy is, because we're watching it on Facebook Live, so I can get back out there to close the service. And I always saw this guy I went to high school with name watching the service. Always saw it. And then when he passed and his mom called me, she said he watched every week, Prodigal Church. And then when I did the family interview on Monday night of this week, they told me that, I don't know if you know this, but he had agoraphobia. For the last 4 years, he never left his home. He would have panic attacks and anxiety attacks, and watching you on Sunday mornings was his way of going to church. And so you just don't know the impact we make when we put the effort into setting up a phone, setting up a microphone, streaming it online. All of the research and the cameras and all that stuff does make an eternal impact. And so I just want to reiterate what Forrest says. Certainly online is a difference maker in reaching the next generation.
And here's a way less cool story, but oftentimes online can even pay for itself. Really weird story. We just finished a building project. We expanded our kids spaces, and someone who's never attended Neighborhood but watches us online from Texas religiously, a young millennial family, who's well-to-do, sent us a check for $300,000 to invest in our building campaign, and they have never set foot on our campus, and probably never will. And their kids will never enjoy the space, but they just believe in what we're doing, and they sent us a check. So, so it pays for itself as well. So it's a. That's.
Do you see, Forrest, John is asking you for his information. He wants to get that guy on his.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, would you please now pause for just a moment and let's look around at others. Maybe you've got your own stories to tell, or you've got another question, or simply want to weigh in on something. I want to give opportunity for others. Now, I'm glad that some of you have chatted, but maybe you've got something you'd like to say as well.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Dennis.
Hi. Yeah. Hey, question. A question for you guys. And I guess I'll just relate to Mark's situation. What ideas or counsel would you, Forrest and John, or any of you have for some of us who are in our very traditional churches? You know, aside from just blowing it up, you know, and starting over, what are some steps we could take to join you guys in what you're doing? Because we appreciate it, we respect you, and maybe sometimes envy you, but we're not there. So, couple thoughts for us.
Well, I'll start for it. Go.
Wow,
Forrest, you go ahead.
Really rude, John. Go, buddy, go.
Okay, I just want to say, Forrest and I, on behalf of Forrest and I guarantee we have much more to learn from our more established churches than you have to learn from us. So, but we do vastly appreciate the humility in saying that. And so now Forrest's going to take over, but I certainly want to make sure that that's known. You guys have been, you know, we're all still learning a ton from you, and just appreciate you guys' heart and wisdom for sure. Forrest, you go ahead first.
Yeah, well, I would say, one, you know, neighborhood 71 years old this year. It's an older established church. However, we've transitioned, and I think we're learning how to lean in to our boomers and builders more, and make sure that they feel honored and that their faith is valued, and that their role in the mission of the church is still really, really important. And I think we're stumbling our way through that. However, I would point back to when I was at Bethany Church, which was a much older church in terms of age demographic. But we started a college service, and this was just one way. I mean, obviously Fresno Mark is more of a college town than Dinuba, but when we started that college service is we got all of the older crowd together and said, you know, it'd be really great. We're going to start this college service on Thursday nights. Would you make food for them? And got them involved. And I still remember, I mean, my favorite story from that, you know, 150 college kids there, and I just remember this 90-year-old guy. His name was Pete Funk, and he'd always come. I mean, the music just so loud. I mean, it was just crazy, and he would be in the back, and he would just every worship set. And finally, I came up to him and I said, Pete, do you like the music? I was just so astonished. And he said, no, I don't like the music. I hate the music. What I love is watching young people worship. And for me, that, and then the more conversation I had, that was just a huge part of why they did what they did. Seeing the faith of the next generation gave a life to the older demographics. It just brought them so much life. It grew their faith. And so anyway, that's one way. I mean, I think, and I would say what you'd find in Dave Kinnaman's book, it's it's hopeful and also terrifying. But he says, he talks a lot about resilient disciples in what he calls the digital Babylon. Like, how do we create resilient disciples in the digital age, or to use his language, digital Babylon? And his group, Barna Group, has identified 5 things. And one of the 5 is meaningful intergenerational relationships. How can the local church foster meaningful intergenerational relationships? And he says Barna identifies there are only 10% of Gen Z young millennials, only 10% of them they would identify as resilient disciples. So it's very small, but he said of those resilient disciples, there's one of the 5 things that they all have in common is that they have strong intergenerational relationships. One of the reasons at Neighborhood we actually let kids serve in like younger kids ministry is because we pair them with people who are of different generations with them, and they get to rub shoulders with people of different generations. And so anyway, I think it's a, Dennis, phenomenal question, but it's so important. I mean, I think so for any kind of church, it's important to bring the generations together, and because it'll build both generations' faith.
Before you answer, John, I want to say thank you again to everybody who's online with us. We kind of set this up so that the first hour is, I don't know, the first hour, and then we'll stick around for another 30 minutes, and you're all welcome to stay with us. We're not asking anybody to leave, but just want to recognize that some of you may have to go, and want to thank you for coming. Before you go, I'm going to ask Tim Geddert, who is going to be our presenter a month from today in December on a Wednesday morning. I think it's the first Wednesday of December. Tim, what should we expect next time?
Take that away. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and the other microphone too.
Okay, we just moved that out of the way. Yeah, we were, Doug Heidebrecht and I were two of the speakers at a study conference in Canada, in Waterloo, Ontario, a couple of weeks ago. And so we're going to team up and talk about the authority of Scripture and how to understand that and what it means in terms of addressing some of the cultural issues of our day. That was kind of the theme of the study conference in Canada, and we're going to each do a short presentation and have good dialogue about that.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for doing that. Canadian Mennonite Brethren were meeting. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so back to business here. Enough commercial. John, you wanted to respond to Dennis' question as well.
Yeah, I think that as the leaders go, everyone goes, and the church goes. And so, you know, if every person on staff is north of 50 or 40, that would probably reflect quite a bit in the demographics of the congregation. And so I'm the oldest on our staff at 39, and we struggle not with attracting older generation, but in doing effective ministry with them, because none of us are a part of that demographic. It's harder for us to think of, would they like this event or would they like that event? And so so we have some learning to do in that area. And so just because we have a lot of young people doesn't mean all the problems are solved. Like, you know, young people don't have a lot of money, so that creates its own problems. So and so hiring someone of those generations, or at least having the ear of someone from those generations, I think is extremely wise. And just as it is extremely wise for guys like Forrest and myself to, you know, regularly visit, meet with, and ask for insights from people that are life stages ahead of us. And so, but I do think the answer is multi-generational. I think that is the most powerful. I think that's the most, I think that's what we see in the scriptures most commonly, that you don't see young churches and old churches, you see the church. these gathering of people across generational lines, learning and growing with each other as they follow Jesus. And so, you know, we're all in this together.
Thank you.
John,
Your
how old are
stories,
you?
your questions, yes.
I'll be 39 next week.
And I will just say, can I have another commercial, Lynn?
Sure.
Our staff, especially primarily our teaching staff, just brought in the United States, the U.S., the Senate. What is it called? What do you call yourself, Lynn? The Center for Anabaptist Studies?
Center for Anabaptist Studies.
And they did a 3 or 4 day training with our staff on essentially those Becker's three statements. It was so phenomenal for our staff to interact with Mark Baker, Tim Gatter, Lynn Joe, some of the great minds, I think, in Anabaptism today. But for the people, for our staff to get that kind of theological training, you should absolutely contact Lynn and see if that's something that might benefit your team, because it was so good to up the theological bar for our team and align us around some of these key ideas. So anyway, that was just totally not related to what we're talking about, but thought I would throw that out there.
But thank you. And we had a very generous old man who gave us $500,000, and we've got about a $25,000 earning every year without tapping into the principal that we can use to get you to us, and have some fun while we're together. So if you have any interest at all in bringing us to where you are, or going to a fun place together, Forrest and I just were sitting together and said, hey, why don't we do this? So we'll do that for you too. Pull together 3 or 4 churches if you're in Central Oklahoma, and we'll be happy to be with you, or we'll go to Six Flags over, whatever it is. Thanks, Stephen, for the idea of approaching these topics, and that's probably something that's in our future as well. Be happy to work on that. Thank you. Anybody else? Comments or questions or your own stories?
We have a 18-year-old Hindu girl that's been coming to church. Pretty cool. You know, we got a new young adult life group that kind of started up, and so she's participating in that and shares all of her God stories with everybody. And she came up for communion, I think last time we had every month, you know. And so anyway, I just thought, hey, we have got to do some checking on, you know, what is that process like? What's a story like of people who come from a Hindu background into Christian faith? And just fascinating. But some of the same words that are being used about the nuns and duns are, you know, apply in that case. Humility about our own faith. So John, when you're talking about, you know, we value their questions more than our answers. You know, there's a certain kind of humility that's respectable about that. And so anyway, she's been coming. It's pretty neat. We just started Ace Overcomer as a class on Sunday. It's we don't call it Sunday school anymore. It's all life lessons. And so Ace Overcomers is Adverse Childhood Experiences Overcomers by a fellow named Lockridge. And so half the people were from our church and half the people were from the community, especially from Open Gate, which is a you know, transitional housing place next door to us. Their female executive director spoke on Sunday, and she's a childhood friend of mine anyway. It was kind of a cool thing. But I thought another interesting thing about belong, believe, behave, and how mixed up that gets, and how difficult it is for established churches and church people, right? We're people, not institutions, but how mixed up that gets. We're going around the circle, and, you know, people introducing themselves. Hi, I'm Brian. You know, I'm a believer and a survivor. Someone else takes their turn, and I can't share everything about my life at this point, but I want to, because, you know, they're kind of saying just a tiny little bit about it. And I said, you know, I'm a pastor. I'm trying to help this church, you know, address people, you know, that have had these kinds of situations, you know, to find hope and faith in life. And then someone from our church And then his wife next said, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a member of the church. And then the next person, his wife said, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a member of the church. And I couldn't help but just die because I thought, wow, how exclusive that statement was. And what did it really mean? What did it really say to anybody in the room except, hey, I got a star up on my belly and you don't, or something? I don't know what. It was just kind of a strange little statement. So the behavior needs to change, but I know that as soon as I begin to address the behaviors of our people, it's linked to, well, not only do I belong here, I own this place. And what are you saying about my beliefs? Because, you know, and so it becomes a threat. And so how to talk with people about behaving differently while still holding to our beliefs and reshaping what it means to belong here. Those are conversations that are going to be a little while in the making, I think, here. But that's just a story of how that went down in the middle of what I would see as a really positive mission forward kind of event.
Thanks, Mark. Jamie.
Thanks for sharing, Mark. Yeah, I think that's something that is also, I guess, attractive to people of, you know, mid-30s. You mentioned offering a class type that is totally open to anyone in your community. So like we have partnered a number of times with Central Valley Justice Coalition, and they then promote their class online, and it's just held at our place. And it's happens to be held at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And if you want to stay for service too, great. You know, so partnering with people in the community to offer those very practical resources is a great idea. Also, you mentioned communion. If we're talking very nitty-gritty about invitational language when we serve communion, like how are you inviting people into an act that you do maybe once a month? I don't know what everybody does, we do it once a month. But are you using invitational language to know that everyone's seated in that place? Jesus invites them into a relationship. He invites them to participate in a meal with him. Or are we saying, members only, come forward, or those of you who placed your faith in Christ, come forward? Like, it matters the way that we say that in our churches. And I don't know how everyone does it, but as far as I can see in the Gospels, Jesus invites people, even Judas right beside him who was about to betray him, he lets him eat with him. So are we doing the same on a regular basis, invitationally from the front, letting people who are in our place know that they're welcome to participate in these family rituals with us? So that's another that brought to mind when you mentioned communion.
That definitely sounds like heresy, Jamie. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think we definitely model open table. Jesus regularly eats with sinners. I even think of Paul's communion on the boat and different things, right? I think there's good theological kind of argument for an open communion table, and we definitely practice that. So I think, you know, one thing we haven't mentioned is diversity in the church. I think for the millennials and Gen Z and nuns and duns, they notice if you're all white and all male, and even just two genders and all of those things. They notice that. They don't want to be a part of that. I think having a church demographic that reflects the community is really important, and having a church staff that reflects the community is an important. I mean, we've definitely worked hard at that, and prior to us working hard on that, we're regularly called out but for too many white people on our stage, or you know, and we don't really, our staff though is about 70-30 female, And so we're definitely swung the other way. It's definitely not a boys club at Neighborhood, but I wonder just what our churches look like, you know, and do they reflect the community? And I think it matters. I think it's something that they pay attention to.
We're down to just a few folk left, and I don't recognize all of you, but I wonder whether from the Midwest, either Jeremy Jordan in the greater Oklahoma City area, or Tom Byford in my native Hillsboro, if either of you would like to add a comment. It's an invitation, not an expectation, but my pastor is leading something called Painting Your Prayers. I don't know if that's exactly what she calls it, but we've actually had the wives and their husbands attend church in the last couple of weeks just because they were engaged in that. It's a very spiritual activity, and these are Christian people that we've made contact with, but they're also, I think, spiritual people that are interested in those things, and unchurched spiritual people that are looking for other ways. So Jeremy can't comment. Tom is passing to Jeremy, so I guess that takes care of that. Thanks, Mark. I think we'll call it quits if that is okay with everybody present. Hey, Jared, I'm looking at your face, and you've been with us all morning. Can you introduce yourself to us before we go?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm Jared. I'm the youth and family pastor at Heston MB Church, Heston, Kansas. So kind of representing the Midwest, I guess.
That was my first pastoral assignment. Maybe you've heard of me, Jared. Maybe you haven't. And that's why the church is still there, because you haven't heard of me. But
you laid such a good foundation.
It was a fun 8 years for our family. All right. Well, hey, thanks a lot for engaging with us, and blessings on you as you continue your ministry. A special thanks to John and Forrest for your leading. Appreciate it so much. Thanks.